Hello, do you like New Japan Pro Wrestling? Are you a Shin Nihon freak? If so, check out the Super J-Cast with Joel and Damon on the Voices of Wrestling podcast network.
And even if you fucking hate New Japan Pro Wrestling, listen to the Super J-Cast anyway. Not just for our great show reviews, analysis, and pastrami sandwiches, but there's also usually some dick jokes somewhere in the obligatory opening 30 minutes of absolute nonsense we chat about every single week. That's the Super J-Cast for all the best talk about New Japan Pro Wrestling, crisps, and pornography.
This podcast is a member of the Voices of Wrestling podcasting network. Visit voicesofwrestling.com to hear the rest of our great podcasts, as well as show reviews, columns, opinions, and updates across the world of wrestling.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I am your host, as always, Jesse Collings. Joining me here today, first-time guests on the show, someone that I just met a few minutes ago when we were chatting on a Zoom before I started recording this, but someone I'm really excited to talk to. This is Dr. Eric Wesselmann. Dr. Eric Wesselmann is a professor of psychology at Illinois State University. And the reason Eric is here today to talk with us is because I really wanted to explore some of the general topics in fandom and kind of the psychology behind fandom. And a lot of the, I think, things we talk about in the show in many of our previous episodes are related to some of the quirks of fandom and the attitudes of fandom and social media interactions on fandom. And I really wanted to talk to someone who has a lot of experience, not only with different elements of fandom, but also different, has an academic background and can understand some of the psychological aspects of what we're seeing going on in fandom in 2023. Well, I guess it's 2024 now. That's going to, I'll get it right. That'll take me until August to get the right year. But Eric, thank you so much for joining the show today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yes, I sent Eric I discovered Eric when I was researching potential guests, and I sent him a long rambling email about what I was looking for, and Eric was very accommodating and being like, "Yes, let's do it. Let's record something." So I'm really appreciative of that. I guess I'll start with just kind of this general point, which is something that obviously anyone familiar with wrestling fans, but really anyone familiar with fandom in general, has witnessed over the last several years. And it really always existed, but definitely with the prevalence of social media has definitely taken on a new form. And that's the tribal aspect of our fandom, which is people who enjoy something. It could be WWE, it could be Coke, could be Marvel Comics, it could be whatever their fandom is connected to. And they enjoy it so much that they root for it almost as if it's a sports team. And we see that a lot on social media. And I don't know if it's always been like this. You can go back 100 years and see that people were I don't know, arguing about Rudolph Valentino or something like that. The way that they argue about stuff today. But I'm kind of curious just to start, Eric, with your background and your experience, how have you kind of identified, this rooting interest that people have that's now connected to their fandom of whatever that fandom may be? They're now almost supporting it like it's like a sports team where there's a competition that they need to win, as opposed to an art that they enjoy.
So the way I approach fandom and others as well is sort of rooted in the concept of identity. So who we think we are, how we define ourselves. And that's, of course, we could spend multiple podcasts just figuring out what is identity. But the long and short of it is that we have individual characteristics, we have interpersonal relationships, and we have broader identity categories. So groups that we affiliate with, race, gender, religion, country of origin, any number of sort of broader aspects to how we define ourselves. And these all make up who we are. Now, we are motivated to have a generally coherent and positive sense of self. And there are a variety of psychological mechanisms by which we sort of on a daily basis try to keep that afloat. And I think that a general tension that is sort of shown up throughout the psychology of identity and other types of academic disciplines who study that look at this tension between what aspects make us unique to stand out from other people, and at the same time, as social animals, what aspects make us similar to others. And there's just this general daily tension that we have between those two, trying to find a balance point. And the way I and others approach fandom is that fan identities help us find that balance between finding other folks who get us, who like what we like, and also things that make us feel unique from broader popular culture. Yeah.
Yeah, you know what's interesting? I've heard this kind of argument before, which is the evolution of the importance of an individual's taste, right?
Mhm.
As the average standard of living has risen over the last, 100, 200 years, um, there's less out there to distinguish oneself from another person in terms of like material goods, right? You
Mhm.
can still buy a really expensive car or have a really big house or expensive clothing that kind of allows you to stand out from someone else. But especially in terms of like the general middle class person, there's not that much that we can distinguish from each other in terms of like purchasable goods, or materialistic items. And, everyone that I know, all of my friends have cars, for instance. All of my friends have houses that they live in. Some of us don't own our houses, but that's beside the point.
Right.
But everyone kind of has, it's not like, 100, 200 years ago where you have this, you're either really rich or you're like really poor.
Mhm.
Um, and like as we kind of lose those kind of social distinctions, that are really clear and obvious, individual taste has taken on a bigger part of a person's personality because that can distinguish ourselves from each other. And that's kind of a similar point you were saying, is that like this fandom, this and like kind of like the peacocking of this fandom is, in some ways kind of related to like we can't really brag about our materialistic items anymore. What makes us different, and in some cases, what makes us feel superior to other people, if we're all kind of on the same playing field. And one of those things would be like, well, I have this really good taste in these things that I like, and you don't. And that becomes a bigger part of our identity.
Yeah. So the idea of expressing something about oneself, right? So clothing. Um, I'm thinking about back into high school, and junior high, when for most people that's when these concepts of individuality, at least in this country, really start to emerge. Uh, we say, okay, I like this type of music, so I'm going to buy T-shirts if I can that show that to other people. Or you pick jewelry, hairstyles, hair colorings. Any of these different markers are things that are meant to communicate to others something that you want to show them, right? And we do that interpersonally, face-to-face contact. We do that online. We curate our social media presence, again, with information that helps other people kind of get to know us. So we may find other wrestling fans, or other fans of punk rock or goth or metal or hip hop, or MCU, or whatever it is. But even within that, you go to a fan space, you go to a concert, you go to a con, and you have you're all there for the same general reason. But you may pick, okay, I got this OG T-shirt, right, that communicates I liked this band in their first two albums, and maybe more recent fans aren't going to get it. But there's going to be someone else there who sees that reference and is like, I gotcha. So there's a distinguishing there too. We have been OG fans, or we like this phase
Yes,
of a
it's
particular
they're
artist.
gatekeeping.
Exactly right. Or I like this character when they were a heel or a face, or the Raw years or the WCW years or whatever, right? There's this tension between we're all here for the same reasons, we like similar things, but we also have our uniqueness within that.
One of the really interesting things that has really exploded, certainly in wrestling fandom, and I've noticed in other things too, is individual fans' interests in the economics behind uh, wrestling. And also, I mean, I say this as someone that co-hosted a podcast called WrestleNomics. Um, but there's a ton more interest in things like television ratings, in revenues that are being driven in the industry by live attendance, these kind of business metrics that largely and I'm a firm believer that the interest in these metrics is largely built around people wanting to feel like they're right. And so they're
Mm,
looking for information that says like, well, this wrestling show that I liked did a great television rating, therefore I can affirm that my taste is correct. And if this thing that I didn't like, or this thing that this person who I don't like likes, did a bad television rating, therefore I can say this person is incorrect because the masses don't agree with them, which isn't really like have anything to do with like artful criticism. It's more of just looking for additional information to feel justified in whatever terminal argument there's in. And certainly I've noticed that like in box office totals, there's a bigger interest in movie fans. And movie fans would like to if you're a Marvel fan, you might want to make fun of, Black Adam and The Rock for not doing well and bombing at the box office. And if you're not a Marvel fan, you might be like, oh, the Marvels did really poor. And so people kind of use that information. But I feel like that's definitely something that's growing in interest in fandoms across the board. And it's largely being used to score points in online arguments and for other people to make themselves feel like they're correct in their taste.
yeah. So and I noticed you made this point earlier, this idea of feeling superior. And it's certainly not unique to fandom, nor do I think it's a new phenomenon. I think we may just see it in different ways, or we may see it more regularly because social media sort of amplifies this division. Um, Earlier I mentioned that we sort of had this general psychological need to see ourselves positively. And there are various ways to do that. And in terms of sort of group identity, um, to start with, we have so who am I, and who is like me and who is not like me, right? And this sort of an in-group out-group distinction. Now, there's nothing necessarily, I'll use the term wrong, wrong with that when it's just descriptive, just recognizing difference among folks. For better or for worse, though, the shift between in-group love, liking people who are similar to you, who get what you get, your found family, your tribe, whatever phrase you want to use, your team, liking who is like you and disliking who is not like you, we step over that line relatively easily. And some of it has to do with this issue of comparison, that for whatever reason, part of feeling good about ourselves means we have to have something to compare that to on an evaluative dimension, right? And so again, when I grew up, I was really into music. I still am. I have over 1,500 CDs, and I don't even know how many digital albums, but being in a lot of different subcultural music spaces, there is sort of a pecking order. And in the context of bands, one of the big divisions is, well, have you always been a fan of them, or for a while, or were you only a fan when they were popular, right? And in sports teams, you see this when people talk about fair weather fans,
Mhm.
right? So I'm from Illinois, and there's this, the Cubs have probably had many losing seasons compared to winning seasons, and you have these folks who are like, oh, were you a Cubs fan the entire time in the worst of times, or only when it makes you look good? And that becomes sort of this dynamic tension between fans. And I think at the core of it is, for those folks who are OG fans, who maybe were fans of something when it wasn't popular, maybe they took some crap for that, right? And that hurts us. That's a type of exclusion. I've done research on that. When someone makes fun of what we like, we take it as a personal slight. And so if we're, liking something when it's not popular, and then suddenly it becomes popular, now we're like, well, WTF? Why did I suffer through this? And now suddenly you're all on board. So I think that's part of this larger tension between hating on someone else's passion and taking pleasure, perhaps, in this case, a lack of box office, like you mentioned.
Yeah, and it's kind of like it's kind of interesting because I feel like there's like two types of um fandom in the sense of like you have there's this interest in being there's almost like as like counterculture has really existed and largely taken over in some ways become like our main form of pop culture in a lot of ways in this country. Like there's almost like this intense badge of honor in being like an OG fan. Or
Mhm.
like part of becoming a fan of something is that so you can one day get upset about all these new bandwagon fans that have hopped on board. Like that's literally something that people I think like whether they are intentionally doing or unintentionally doing it, they're looking forward to the one day where they can eventually complain about and get to gatekeep a little bit. Um, that's almost seen as like a rite of passage in fandom. And yet at the same time, there's also like the psychology of like people wanting to like the popular thing, wanting to feel accepted. And we kind of feel like people are coming from it in two different angles almost. Like you have the people who are really want to get that kind of almost dopamine rush of being able to gatekeep a little bit, but you also have the people that are just looking to like this popular thing and justification for liking this popular thing.
Yeah. Well, and so you mentioned earlier, like this issue of box office and looking to what's popular. And again, being, social beings, we take that as some type of information, not just early on in a fandom, but throughout, right? We look to others who we view as peers to kind of get some information on should I pay attention to something. I mean, certainly with the internet, with the accessibility of more options, we only have so much time and energy, right? And so I like to joke with my students when I talk about, for example, music, right? So Amazon came out really when I was in my early 20s. Um, Before that, if you liked, something that was more niche, like, punk or metal or goth or whatever, um, you had to be able to have access to that. So unless you lived in like a college town, right, where there were maybe some UCD stores where you could find these things, if you were lucky, the local major music stores at your mall maybe had a few of these things. But again, they would only order that if they thought it was particularly popular. More often, what you had to do was either buy a sampler or happen upon a CD that had um, a small catalog in that CD, or maybe send a self-addressed stamped envelope to some location that they would then mail you back a hard, catalog. You then sent your check in the mail or well-concealed cash to get what you needed. Maybe if you were really lucky, you lived in an area where there were cons right nearby where you could go and meet people who had similar interests. You could buy the merch that you needed. I mean, you know, early 90s when anime started to break, where you started getting anime showing really late at night on the Sci-Fi Channel and then maybe on Saturday mornings. And then finally Cartoon Network came in, right? Now you have more accessibility, but before that, you had to find these bootleg tapes. You had to find a friend who happened to be willing to record for you something to be exposed to that. The benefit of having this type of e-based world where we can get whatever we want whenever we want um, opens up a lot of avenues. But then you got to decide, okay, well, what's good, quote unquote good, right? Well, especially if you're new in a genre, you're going to say, well, what are people most talking about? That's one cue. Then, as you get into a genre of music or of entertainment or whatever, then you're going to start to hear conversations where people who've been there for a while, who maybe have a more critical view on something, a more nuanced view, are going to say, okay, well, yes, there are all of these bands who share this particular label, but some of them have a more complex music structure. Or, yes, you have all these different wrestling industries, but some of them have more complicated storylines, or others of them are more interested in crowd interaction, right, in a live show, and how they uh, please fans in that regard. And maybe others are more interested in how many views they get, so they're going to be doing pretty similar things. They're not going to experiment as much, right? You look at pop music, for example, right? I mean, music, a lot of auto tuning. There are a lot of paint by numbers type song compositions. Things start to sound the same. Then you have particular artists that maybe want to experiment a little bit more. I mean, I remember when they talk about crossover artists, or I'm really going back in time here now, but like in the mid 90s, the country star Garth Brooks wanted to do more of a rock album. And so he created a different persona. The name's currently escaping me, but it was, everybody kind of knew it was Garth Brooks, but they wanted a different label so that old school fans of Garth Brooks who would maybe buy it and expect a traditional country album weren't upset by what they got. I mean, this is why a lot of other bands will do side projects, right? They want to get experimental, but they don't want to buck the trend too much to avoid.
They don't want to be Dylan Goes Electric.
There you go.
Yeah. Yeah, don't be worried about the dated references on the show.
All right.
Yeah. What's
I
interesting
still
about,
remember WrestleMania 8.
yes.
And was that when Hulk Hogan, I can't remember who Hulk Hogan was fighting, but I feel like the Ultimate Warrior did a run in, and then that's my last major memory.
Okay, yes, of course you're referring to WrestleMania 8 from the Indiana Hoosier Dome against yes.
Yes.
Where he of course wrestled Sid Vicious.
That's what it was. Okay,
yeah.
thank you.
The Yeah, well, one of the things that's really fascinating that you kind of got into is, especially as we, you talked about music and how like relatively inaccessible it was up until very recently. And I think anime is also a good point because you can make basically the exact same thing happened with um, Japanese pro wrestling, which was
Mm-hmm.
in the 80s and 90s, a very, very niche group of fans we call in the wrestling industry, we refer to them as tape traders, would you'd get a tape from Japan, usually starting by somebody going to Japan on a trip and buying tapes. And you would pass them around, you would share them, you would make copies of them, you would be like literally, communicating via letter with people that you were talking to via wrestling magazines. Um, and you would be mailing each other, what tapes you had, just probably exactly similar to what you're describing when anime first became big in the early
Mm-hmm.
90s. And now, of course, just like anime, where you can basically watch anything that exists, just with a few mouse clicks, no matter, how obscure it may be. The same is true for wrestling from other countries. Basically every Japanese wrestling promotion you can find really easily through a few clicks of the mouse online. And that has made it way more accessible for people, and it has, in some ways, made it less of a niche. Um, and has, I think, in a lot of ways, greatly complicated wrestling fandom just in general, because one of the major shifts that we've noticed in the last 10 years is if you were, or if you fancied yourself a big wrestling fan, you pretty much only had to know about WWE. No other wrestling promotion was significant enough, really, to matter that much. So we had a lot of people that started podcasts, a lot of people that started websites and blogs and YouTube channels, and all they ever knew was WWE. And that was okay because that's all anyone ever wanted to talk about. But as alternative wrestling companies have become easier to access online, just like music and anime and anything else, uh, WWE's ubiquity in terms of being the thing that everyone talked about has lapsed to a degree. And what's happened is a lot of these people that fancy themselves experts have been exposed by really only understanding one brief slice of the overall wrestling industry, and that's the corner that WWE occupies. Everything else, they have a hard time digesting. They have a hard time understanding how those wrestling companies tell their stories. They have a hard
Mhm.
time understanding how those wrestling companies present their product, how they present their characters. And it has led to a lot of the debate and clashes, which is largely these people that I think ended up with a form of like almost like arrogance and being like, well, I'm the wrestling guy. But
Mhm.
realistically, they were only knowledgeable about a very, very brief portion of it, which was okay up until a few years ago where other stuff became much more popular. And I think that has led to a lot of the kind of attitude clashes you might see online, which is people who are unable or disinterested in recognizing other aspects of the industry that haven't been key to WWE.
So I'm hearing a couple different things there, and I can't speak to these specific people you're talking
Yeah.
about, but just the sort of um, things that I'm resonating with, right? The phrase used, "I'm the wrestling guy," right? Or
Mhm.
that's an identity statement, right? As
Exactly.
opposed to maybe someone saying, "Well, I'm the WWE wrestling person," or "I'm like." So I think whenever people start debating what's quote unquote right or wrong, particularly in these domains of aesthetics, really, um, it's probably good to try and always keep in mind that when we, because I'm sure I use those statements myself, I try not to, but there are certainly times, um, that there's some amount of what my good friend and psychology fan nerd Scott Jordan would say, is identity work. That it's, again, going back to sort of what I started with, this idea that we have these tensions, um, and to stand out, but also to fit in. And at the sort of end of the day, we want to see ourselves positively, however we define that, right? And so if we are approaching this by saying, I'm an expert, and I'm an expert in this huge domain versus this niche, right?
Yeah.
I may
These are people
differ
who
how I make my comparisons.
these are people who have careers like as like pundits, so they run websites. Um, I had a former I used to write for a website called wrestlinginc.com. Um, our boss Raj Giri, who is very successful in running this wrestling website, um, but really only ever understood WWE, and still to this day really only understands WWE. And that was fine for the first 20 years he ran the website. And then all of a sudden it wasn't fine because other wrestling promotions, other wrestling ideas became prominent enough. And he's kind of been constantly fighting this war where he fancies himself this expert and it's been his career for the last 20, 25 years, but he really only knows a very small percentage of the wrestling business. And I think struggling to uh instead of being like, okay, I've got to learn more, it's been more of an attitude of like, I'm gonna double down and be like, I don't need to learn this stuff because I have this identity that and if I were to concede that I don't know as much as I think I do, then that would like shatter my own self-identity.
Yeah, so again, not being able to speak specifically to your former boss, but just sort of thinking about from my own experience, right? I've been publishing in psychology. Most of my work is on the dynamics of social inclusion and exclusion, right? And I well cited across the world, but there's also a lot of research out there that I just have trouble keeping up with. And so I continually have to sort of stop and ask myself, okay, do I need to know more about this? Am I okay with maybe saying, all right, I'll make room for some other folks? And in what domains, right? And that's, we talk about identity sometimes, just like as lay people, we talk about identity as who I am, and we think that's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. But identity is dynamic. Not only does it change throughout our lives, but it can change in the context that we're at, right? And so maybe when you are at a house show for wrestling, certain brand labels are important to you, right? But let's say you are outside of that house show and you're in a different environment and you meet someone who you like WWE, they like a Japanese circuit or some other brand, but hey, we're the only three wrestling fans in here and everybody else likes something we don't. Now, suddenly in that moment, you're much more similar than you are different.
Mhm.
And your identity values in that moment will have a different dynamic than if you were in a context, well, we're all wrestling fans, but I like my guy and you like yours. And now we're butting heads.
Yeah, and that's, I think, like a consequence of whether it's being on social media or being on a Discord channel or things where you're taking the setting really matters, whether or not we're in this, digital room with all these, like, with thousands and thousands of wrestling fans, or in an actual setting where realistically there's only a few of us that will even have any idea what we're talking about because we're in this niche fandom. I think that's a really strong point. I wanted to ask you about, like, the kind of developing parasocial relationships that people end up having. I think I've seen a lot and read a lot about, you know, loneliness and people's feelings like they attach more emotional weight to individual performers or characters or TV shows or whatever. It could be an individual person, or it could be a form of media. But, like, do you think that that is something like basically the standard thought I've heard is that, well, people are less social than they used to be in person, and people work from home, people don't have as many friends as they used to, kids don't hang out at the playground anymore, whatever, you know, old-fashioned terminology you want to use to describe what's different about people today than people decades ago. Um, that people end up forming these, like, stronger parasocial bonds with their fandom that didn't maybe exist pre-internet and didn't exist when our social system was a little bit different. Um, do you buy that in the sense of, like, there has been the way our social system has evolved over the last several decades has created this dynamic where people are much more likely to fall into uh intense emotional attachment to people or things they've never met or directly interacted with?
So in the absence of data, I sort of go back and forth because there probably is something to changes over time. Um, I don't know about. Bear with me here as I think on the spot. Um, I don't know how much of it is an increase in quantity and maybe just different opportunities, right? And so I think having quote unquote parasocial relationships is not new. Um, as far back as people have created stories, we've connected to characters. That's part of why stories exist. Stories exist to both entertain and teach, and good stories are things that bring us into the narrative. And a lot of ways of doing that is to give us characters who either share some aspect of ourselves in terms of identity, or maybe have similar experiences, things that we can resonate with, to be like, okay, I don't know what it's like to fight Voldemort, or I don't know what it's like to march on the black gates of Mordor, or whatever. But I know what it's like to have challenges in my life. And so I can see resonance, similarities in these characters. And that's, again, something that seems to be um, not bounded in time, but the things that connect us to stories, to characters, to products, there's something that makes us feel like we are connected both and so there's the belonging element, and there's also that sort of identity dynamic that's going on there. Certainly there are people who have talked about anecdotally how maybe they didn't have solid home relationships, or maybe they didn't have a lot of friends growing up for whatever reason, and so they found those friends in books, in comics, in the movies that they watch. These are the narratives that we return to. And a lot of people will talk, for example, about rewatching a movie or rereading a book, revisiting old friends. And we respond to stories based on what we like or don't like. And when things happen to those characters, as is going to happen, for example, in a person who's got, let's say, a wrestling character who's got a 30-year career, right? And things got to change up. Musicians, they can't always play the same style for their entire career. Comic book characters, right? Characters that have existed since the 1930s or 40s change as new creative teams come in. They try some things that work with fans, they try some things that don't. Research on fanfic, for example, very much approaches this idea from, do we like the stories that new creators tell, right? And if a character suddenly changes in a way that we don't like, maybe that no longer becomes headcanon. Maybe we tell our own stories, right? When a series ends, when Harry Potter ended, people were really, really upset. Stephen King wanted Rowling to write more books and was willing to pay her to do that, right? Because we want these relationships or parasocial relationships to continue, because they're, in some ways, they're part of how we see ourselves.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting thing in terms of like your relationship, like how similar and especially in wrestling, because the characters that are portrayed kind of walk this fine line between real and fake. They're not totally like scripted characters like you would see on a TV drama necessarily, but they're also not totally real. And I think in that realm, it panders to people more. People are more likely to identify with those characters because there's an element of reality to them that doesn't necessarily exist in more traditional scripted entertainment. But at the same time, they're also in this manufactured dramatic setting uh, to tell a story.
Right, there's sort of in almost an improv going on, because certain wrestlers, for example, maybe they go by their actual name or a more traditional name, like John Cena, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if John Cena is that person's original birth name, but it sort of fits a
No, it is. It is. Yeah.
okay, well, so there you go then, right? Whereas for example, you've got the Godfather, right, who
Yes.
was also Papa Shango at some point in time, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
Um, you
Correct.
have the Undertaker, who for a while was the traditional dead man Undertaker, and then became more of a demonic character, and then became the American Badass, the bike riding, right? And so these are different iterations, and some of those characters are more quote unquote characters we recognize as a role, but in other contexts, if they're less of a performance and more of a sort of real person, still curated, right? But we might feel more connected to them in that regard. Yeah, it would be really interesting to see how celebrities navigate that space. I use an older documentary now. It was probably 2000, 2001, but it was one that the cult film actor Bruce Campbell from the Evil Dead Army of Darkness series made. And in that particular documentary, which was called Fanalysis, so it was dissecting fan spaces, one of the featured guests was Ted Raimi, right, who was a longtime stable in Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell's films. Ted Raimi talked about how when you go out and you interact in a fan space, it's a really interesting line that you have to walk, because you meet these folks, they're paying you because they want that experience of meeting this celebrity, and you want to give them a little bit more than just, here, I signed your stuff, get out of my face, right? Because we connect with these people parasocially. We want a good experience. And I can just personally, I can think about the people I've met, the stars who have been very, very accessible in some ways. They're not showing me everything about themselves, right? But they're nice. They're giving me a little something. And then I can think of the people I met who I really had a sour taste in my mouth. And you know what? I probably met them on a really bad day. Who knows? Maybe they had a death in the family or something else, right? But all I remember is that moment, and it was either very positive or very negative. That said, even when I've met people, fan or celebrities who've kind of let me in a little bit, they're still not my friends, right? There's still that divide, and that was what Tenrami was continually coming back on: is you give them a little, but you got to have some boundary. And so just it's a very tricky tension, and I can only imagine how difficult it is for many of these celebrities to walk.
Yeah, they're the original motivation for me to seek someone like you out and do an episode like this was it took place a couple of weeks ago. I witnessed an incident. Um, I uh I know somebody who they liked a tweet that was critical of this other semi-prominent social media personality. I think they have like, maybe 10,000 followers on Twitter or something like that. But it's through pro wrestling and pro wrestling, influencer, whatever term you want to use to describe that. And so this person I knew liked a tweet that was critical of this semi-prominent person. And then that semi-prominent person went on to like tweet like 30 times or whatever. And maybe it wasn't as 30 times, but it was an insane amount of tweets about how mad they were that this person liked a tweet that was critical of them. And I saw that and I'm like, all right, this is kind of like your typical, like kind of unhealthy social media relationship. This person is taking something very personally and making a big deal about it, probably for attention for themselves. And that wasn't really something that was notable to me. But what really was notable to me was that this person had their followers and other people like also getting upset about this person liking this tweet. So it goes beyond just this person feeling personally affronted by this person that liked a tweet that was critical of them. We're now like through another connection uh of relationship, which is now, I guess, friends and fans of this semi-prominent person are now joining on board and talking about how upset they are that this person liked a tweet. So it's like, it's not just an unhealthy social media relationship, it's like an unhealthy social media relationship by proxy, where because people are fans of this person who has kind of what I would describe as an unhealthy social media relationship, they in turn develop unhealthy social media relationships. And the whole thing was so weird and bizarre to me that we're now it's one thing like I think I sent this in an email to you. Like I use Taylor Swift as an example. Like Taylor Swift has millions and millions of big fans around the world. And because of that, she has all of these other people that are running, Taylor Swift fan pages. I don't even know if fan pages really exist anymore, like they used to. Like, but like they've Twitter accounts, Instagram accounts, YouTube channels, TikToks, whatever social media
Mhm.
platform they have. Um, and because they're these fan pages for a very famous person, those fan pages end up getting their own fans with the shared connection being like, I like Taylor Swift, so I follow this Taylor Swift Twitter account that like posts pictures of her or whatever. But that person ends up gaining this kind of influence over people, not because just because they're running this fan accounts, and they're kind of using Taylor Swift's popularity to gain uh popularity on their own. And the dangerous aspects of that are um, Taylor Swift has a very curated self-image, and there's factors in play that would prevent Taylor Swift from promoting misinformation online, for saying mean and vile things, and just there's a professionalism that comes with that. That professionalism does not extend to any of these people that are running these fan blogs because they're just random people online. who have no direct connection with Taylor Swift at all. And
I like the point that you make about things being curated, right? And
Mhm.
so this is and I don't think this is unique to this particular context. I've had these discussions a lot with folks I know in the cosplay community, and the folks who are quote unquote cos famous versus the ones who are not, who maybe aspire to be. Um, Much of this stuff, well, probably all of it to some degree, is curated, right? The certainly at the high end of things where someone has enough cred, has enough resources, etc., to have a team to dedicate to sculpting their image, right? And then for people who are not at that level, it may be easier to sort of not recognize that that's what's going on, right? And so, if all you see is the hits, you're not seeing the misses, and it's easier to assume that that person has no bad days if you're not getting that information. um I So when thinking about this idea of the fan phenomena, however we might define that, there are two things going on here, two major dimensions. There's the connection to the fan object, right? The celebrity, the product, the whatever, the parasocial relationship, as you mentioned earlier. And then there's the interpersonal aspect. There's the fandom, the connection to other people who satisfy your need for belonging because you like similar things, right? And those sometimes fit together, sometimes they're at odds, right? And so I like to think of these different phenomena that you're describing within those contexts, right? So thinking about growing up, right? You've got friends, and if someone insults your friend, you're pissed off by proxy, right? Because that friendship is part of your identity. So someone saying something negative about your best friend kind of insults you. And we can think of this as sort of a spreading activation, right? So let's say I really like this wrestler or this pop star, or this actor, and someone else insults that person. Maybe to some degree, I feel like it rubs off on me. Whether or not it quote unquote should is another story, right? But it is. And so that may be one way of understanding this sort of spreading toxicity that you're kind of describing.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about this because I truly believe I've been saying this for a few years, and as I've further thought about it, I see no real reason to think that my hypothesis is incorrect. But I truly believe in wrestling, the divide um in fans stems from people who are incurious versus people that are curious, in the sense of, and this is true in wrestling, and I think it's true in music and movies and everything else, which is, I'll use movies as an example just because I think it's easier for everyone to understand. If I go up to somebody and I say, I just saw this foreign Italian film. It's amazing. You should check it out. Or I think this foreign Italian film is the best movie I've seen this year. It's better than Barbie or Oppenheimer or whatever someone's favorite movie was from this past year. Some people are going to react by saying, "Oh, wow, this person really likes this movie that I've never heard about, and it's a little bit different because it's a foreign film in Italian. I'm gonna try out and see that because I'm interested in why that people think this movie is so good." And there's other people that are going to be like, "Oh, this movie that I've never heard of, there's no way it could be better than these other major movies. I'm not going to listen to that. This person's just a contrarian, or this person's just trying to be a hipster, or whatever." And I think in wrestling, that's like 100% the divide that people have. It's people who are hear about something that they've never heard of before, and they're interested in learning more. And there's people who hear about something they've never heard of before, and they see that almost as like as a threat to their own interests. And I'm kind of curious to know, like, is there like a psychological background to that theory in terms of people who, there just seems to be two different types of people who are curious enough to be interested in something they never heard of before versus people who feel safety in what they already know and are not interested in finding out things that they don't.
So I think it may depend on what are the core reasons because there's probably multiple, why someone is a fan of something, right? And so you can look at this in, a lot of different fan literatures, horror movies, quote unquote bad movies, any number of things. There are a diversity of reasons why we might connect with something, and it's they all may be there to some degree. We might think about this as like an audio mixer, right? And so let's say one channel is the interpersonal connection with other people, another is something unique to that artistic experience, right? So I really love innovation in music, novel sounds, or I really love, the wrestlers who perform a character differently, or maybe I love the physicality, right? The ones who are willing to take chances with extreme stunts, or the ones who are willing to take more, like the hardcore wrestling, right? The ones who are willing to be hit with barbed wire.
Mhm.
Or any other number of things. Like a fan may endorse 1, 2, or 20 of those channels to different degrees, right? So we'll start there. And then extending that beyond, the question may become, let's say I'm a person who really just wants to know everything I can know about anime, right?
Mhm.
All of the cultural nuances that I'm just, not getting as someone who's maybe not from Japan, or whatever. And so I'm gonna go out and this is sort of me now. When I go to the library to get a book or two on a topic, I come back with 15 books because I just want to know um, every little detail I can about something that interests me. Now that's an individual difference, right? That said, I'm also going to take into consideration social aspects. So I'm going to weight people's views differently, right? And so, yeah, there may be people who are just not intellectually curious about something new. They want something safe. There may be other people who are like, yeah, I'm going to dial up that audio channel a little bit more. However, I'm going to take, Jesse's suggestions more on board than I'm going to take Eric's, right? For whatever reason, because you share more experience. Maybe I value that person's perspective, that influence. I value influencer A's view more than the influencer B, or some combination there. How to tease that apart? Well, that's probably a series of studies in and of itself. But I think you're onto something there.
Yeah, it's to me it just seems like in wrestling the big divide is pretty much WWE is pretty much, I mean, if you're an older fan, it might not, you might still remember WCW or the territories that existed, before
I,
the
I
mid.
think I have some trading cards from WCW.
Yeah, like you might remember that, but for the most part, and at this point, WCW and WWE are kind of like the same in terms of the product that they presented in most fans' mind, even though there were significant differences. But certainly people for my age, I'm 29. Um, like WWE is the introduction to pro wrestling for everyone for the most part. Like 99% of people in this country that got into wrestling, they started watching WWE because it was the most accessible, it was on cable, it was the most popular, so you would see it online. However you found it, that's pretty much how you found pro wrestling was being introduced to WWE.
Mhm.
And at some point, people came up to you or you read online or your friend told you about something and they said, here's this other wrestling promotion that you need to know about. I discovered another wrestling promotion because when I was 10, my we were at Toys R Us getting a present for my friend's birthday party, and they had my friend was a big wrestling fan, and we were going to get him like a little like a wrestling ring for action figures, and there were two rings available. One was the WWE ring, and one was for another wrestling promotion called TNA. And TNA had theirs was like $5 cheaper, and my mom was like, oh, why don't we just get him this ring? It's like the exact same. It just doesn't have the WWE logo. And I said, sure. And then so I gave it to my friend, and my friend was like, oh, I watched some of that wrestling and it was really good. You should watch it too. And I said, cool, more wrestling.
Mhm.
Um, but for some people, like the reason that they're into pro wrestling is because they love WWE, because that was their introduction to them. And
Mhm,
there's not a motivation to be like, well, I'm not going to watch other non-WWE wrestling because that's not what I fell in love with. That's not what I like.
mhm.
Um, and that's probably true. And wrestling's maybe a little bit different than like music or movies because I think people's tastes evolve and are easily more dispersed um, than in those mediums than like something more uh, what's the right word? Like less diverse, I guess is the term. Like it would be kind of really strange if someone only ever listened to one type of music or only ever watched one type of movie. Like I've never met anyone who's like that necessarily.
Mhm,
Um, as opposed to maybe only watching one type of pro wrestling.
mhm.
But that's the distinction is I think like when you talk about like why people like something, I think a lot of it is nostalgia and a lot of people like this is I like WWE wrestling. I don't like whatever something else is because it's different. I'm going to notice the differences too much and it's I don't have this long-term attachment to it.
Mhm.
Um and that's maybe I'm sure you see it like in comic books that maybe some people aren't interested in reading uh whether they're new characters or new magazines or new publishing companies or independent comics or things like that because well I'm only interested in kind of reading the superheroes that I grew up with or the Marvel and DC which I know from where I first got into it. I'm sure it's very similar.
Yeah, I mean, nostalgia is something that, as a phenomena, is identity driven. It is involving a positive view of one's history, which of course is social as well. So um, when you look at a lot of the research on nostalgia for products and things, uh, it has to do with like who you consumed it with. So in the context of movies, right, or um, wrestling, pay-per-views, etc. Maybe you watched it by yourself, but if you did, you probably also talked about it with your peers who also like that afterwards. Um, Music is a little more solitary. You certainly can, invite someone over to listen to some music or put it on in the car. But I feel like things like movies, more visual, there is a more intertwined interpersonal social dynamic to it. I was in preparation for this interview. I was kind of digging through some of the literature on wrestling fans. And how for some folks it very much was, their channel was focused on the art or the history of a character or an industry. For others, it very much was tied into the people they were enjoying it with, right? And so for folks who it is much more of a traditional social interaction, it's you want to share with what you got, right? Or coming to your point about comics, sometimes it also may be time and resources, what you have access to. So if I've only got so much time or money to support one title, maybe two titles, I'm not going to branch out because, especially when you're younger, if you've got your allowance money, um, yeah, I'm doing a lot of research right now on Superman, for example, from the '90s, and there's a period of time where there were 4 or 5 Superman books, and there were a lot of fans writing into the letter column who were like, "I can't afford this many books, right? I've only got so much for my paper route, so I can only buy 2 books. So stop making all these books that I have to keep up with." I could see something very similar to wrestling, right? Even if you're following one um, company, right? If they've got 2 or 3 shows a week, right? Raw versus SmackDown. Oh, and then I've got to watch these next 5 different pay-per-views, one a month, maybe 2 a month. Do I got to get the money to buy that? Do I got to go out to, Buffalo Wild Wings or wherever happens to be showing it to keep up with the storyline? That's a
Yes.
lot of investment if you don't
Yeah.
have it.
It's a major issue. I think there's All Elite Wrestling, which, recently popped up as kind of WWE's biggest competitor over since, WCW closed 20 some years ago. And they started out where they only had one show, weekly show on Wednesday nights, and that was easy for people to follow. And as the company has become more successful, the TV networks have been like, oh yeah, we'll give you more programming. And no one's going to turn that down because it's way more money. But now they have a 1 hour show on Friday nights and an additional 2 hour show on Saturday nights. So they went from 2 hours per week of television to 5 hours per week per television. And some people are like, it's too much. I can't follow it. And they lose all interest in it as opposed to, cutting something out here or there. Or I just won't watch the new shows, but it becomes overwhelming. Like you said, you talked about the Superman books in the 90s. Like I can't follow this. It's too much. And certainly, for me, my wrestling fandom, even though I pursue a lot of different promotions, I would always love to watch more, but I can't. I just literally don't have that much time.
Right. As you get older and life becomes more complicated, you get less and less time for these things.
Well, I always joke there's a I always like to say like, oh, this is the year I'm gonna watch more of this promotion. Usually it's like a Japanese promotion.
Mhm.
And what happens is in Japanese pro wrestling, New Year's Day is like a huge day. All these promotions produce major shows right on New Year's Day, January 1st. And so I always say like, all right, this year I'm gonna follow more of this, and then like I'm already just instantly behind, completely unable to catch up right on January 1st, even before January 1st, because technically these are taking place, since they're in Japan, they're taking place on December 31st my time. So
Mhm.
before like the year even starts, I'm already behind. And I was like, all right, I guess I can't watch because I'm already defeated because I can't watch 7 wrestling shows on January 1st. So I'm never going to be able to catch up. And then I never end up watching the rest of the shows for the rest of the year because I just feel like I've already missed out. And I think across all of fandom, as more and more content keeps getting produced, you're seeing that. Like I think you're definitely seeing that with like the Marvels. Marvel has multiple movies a year, but now they have the Disney Plus shows, and there's this huge, you know, yeah, you don't technically have to watch all of them to know what's going on, but there's this greater saturation of our media, especially the most popular stuff, just gets produced, to infinity as much as people are willing to pay, and it does make following it much more difficult.
Oh yeah, I'm so totally behind on Marvel. You use the term, I've already missed out. And I really like that you use that term because fear of missing out is a big thing. Now, so for me, like in my stage in life right now, where you know middle aged, my kids are getting older, and I just have less time. Um, I've sort of, I've got just the ever growing queue of movies and TV shows to watch. And in my mind, I'm kind of just like, all right, I'll get to it someday. However, I also have lots of friends who are not in that same situation. And if I want to try and keep up with the conversation, right? So many of my psych friends who are in this nerd space are all up on Marvel and they're doing podcasts uh, to get the likes. So they need to be contemporary. They need to have that show out 2 minutes after that season drops. So to be relevant to the conversation, yeah, there is that issue that by missing out, it really is problematic for what you want, right? And you've got this podcast. You're a journalist who works on wrestling, right? And so being behind means something different to you than it would be to me if I were in that same space because I'm doing things differently, right? And so that we're not all experiencing the fear of missing out in the same way.
Mhm. The last topic I want to touch on is, and again, this is really big, I think, in wrestling fandom, but you mentioned doing a lot of work on like exclusion and doing some studies looking at like hobbies and interests that have a social stigma. I think off air you mentioned like talking to like the brony community, like the
Mhm.
the the men, the adults who like My Little Pony and these kind of fandoms that are less socially acceptable for a lot of people. Do you feel like there's like really significant differences between fans in those fields as opposed to fans of maybe more traditional acceptable entertainment that exists that really shouldn't exist, but because of the stigma that's associated with them, it leads to kind of maybe different things you notice and different behaviors?
Yeah, so there are going to be nuances across fan categories. And most of my work has sort of just kind of been agnostic to the types, and just sort of looking at, do people respond positively to what we dig or negatively? And my work found that, generally speaking, we of course feel a sense of belonging, inclusion with other people who like what we like. But we when we get to know people, there's diversity in things. We don't always have to enjoy the same things, right? So I love horror films. My wife can't stand them. I love Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, and my wife can't stand them. But she respects the fact that I like these things, right? If she didn't, we probably wouldn't have had a longevity of the relationship that we had. And the same is true with my friends, right? We don't all like the same things, but we can respect the fact that someone likes it, right? So I call myself a fan of fandom. Generally speaking, I try not to judge other people. I try not to yuck their yum, right? As long as, even if I don't understand it, right? Personally, if they enjoy it, it doesn't hurt someone else, it gives them joy. If I respect them, I want to respect their tastes, right? If I don't, or if they don't respect mine, I'm going to feel less connected to them. I'm going to feel to some degree more excluded. And, growing up, pre-internet and all these things, and liking things that were less popular, I loved comics when there was no MCU. It wasn't comics were still considered to be not just for kids, but for nerdy kids, right? Many of my peers were trading baseball cards, but they didn't understand why I was trading Marvel or DC cards. And I'm like, dude, it's just a piece of cardboard with some stats on the back, But in my mind, I saw them as not different. But culturally, there was a value difference placed on that. Sports were making more money, right? These were people who were they had skills in a way that was considered to be more socially acceptable, right? And so that matters, just like bronies, right? Or any type of if you like something that is considered to be socially either devalued on the mainstream or crossing an identity category, right? So bronies, largely men, but there are women too. But you've got men liking an adults, men, women who like a show that is geared towards younger kids, right? There's a quote unquote cultural transgression there. There is also the gender binary crossing, and there could be any other number of things that people sort of violate mainstream views. That's going to be devalued, that's going to be stigmatized, right? I mean, wrestling is also something that, although it makes a lot of money, probably still has some amount of stigma to it. There's a group of people called Disney adults, right? Who Disney is very, very popular. Traditional Disney films, right? The animated films, Disneyland, right? There are many adults who have a fond nostalgia for that, who continue to do it. And there are people who are like, why do you like something that's for kids? My view is, go to hell. Why shouldn't I? Right? That's why I'm angry. That's my response. But I think it is important to recognize that when we like something, we bring that into our self-concept. And so when you hear someone else expressing their fan interests, and they're telling you that, they're letting you know something about who they are. Now, it's okay to disagree. It's okay to say, you know what, that's not my thing. But there's a difference between saying, that's not my thing, but tell me why you like it, versus, that's not my thing, and you're stupid because you like it, right? There's a shift there that I think we need to sort of always keep in mind.
Yeah, wrestling's really interesting in the sense that, like, the number one thing people know about wrestling is that it's fake. Like, if I say, like, oh, I like wrestling, like, the number one response people will get, people that couldn't name, like, a single wrestler, they'll say, like, oh, but it's fake, right? Which in a lot of ways is, like, a really weird, if you boil it down, is a very weird criticism. Like, yes, the matches are predetermined, but, like, when Rocky fought Apollo Creed, that was predetermined too. Like
Hmm.
there's plenty of scripted things that people like. But obviously wrestling has this reputation of trying to pretend to be real in such a way that it comes across as ridiculous. Um, and there's this stigma that's attached to it. And I think a lot of people are, I don't know if they don't understand why they like wrestling or they're afraid to admit it. A really common thing that's emerged lately is people insisting that they don't care about the matches themselves. They don't care about who wins and who loses. They care about the stories. And they're not here to watch matches. They're here for stories. And that's really what is driving wrestling: stories, not matches, not winning and losing. It's characters and stories. And my interpretation of that has always been an insecurity to admit that you like the predetermined nature of it. Like by admitting that you actually like the matches, you're admitting that you like the fake outcomes and you care about who wins and loses, as opposed to saying you care about the characters and the stories feels more socially acceptable to admit because it's like saying you care about the characters and stories in any other scripted drama. Of course, my interpretation for me personally is always, if you like stories, character development, and characters going on a journey, like wrestling is a terrible medium for that. It's really sloppy. The stories are very basic compared to almost anything else. Like if you really just cared about stories, you should
Right.
read a book or watch a TV series. Like you're going to see way better acting. You're going to see way more thought out character development. Like it's really a sloppy medium for that. The reason wrestling is interesting is because you're seeing these characters and stories exist in this weird mock athletic competition where people are trying to prove that they're better than this other person in a test of grappling skill. Like that's the unique charm of pro wrestling, is that they're in this mock athletic competition where they're trying to prove superiority through winning this competition. But I've always taken that kind of criticism as people being afraid to admit that they like that element of pro wrestling because of the stigma associated with it. That if they get away from saying, I don't care about the matches and I don't care who wins and loses and things like that, they're setting themselves up to think like I am what I like is this socially acceptable, mainstream, popular thing, and I don't care about this clearly fake thing that has been stigmatized by traditional society.
Yeah. So not being able to speak specifically to those people you're talking about, just sort of generally, when I hear the sage, well, I don't care about this, I care about that.
Hmm.
I experience that as, again, an identity statement, right? Now, how much of that is putting on a facade to other people, and how much of that is maybe them trying to convince themselves, you know, who knows, but somewhere in between there. I like the point you make about story and how it's delivered, right? So, I love comics, and particularly superhero comics, but comics are unless it's a biopic, right? Most comics, regardless of genre, are fiction. I don't really like reading prose fiction very much. I'm not sure why, but I love devouring it in comic form. So there is something about the expression of those stories, right, in that medium. So it's got to be more than just that. I was thinking about as I was reading a Batman comic earlier today, and appreciating the construction of the page and how you have a story being told with visuals, with text. And it's not just pictures. In this particular comic, it was a symmetry of the page. Like they were building a larger gestalt. I dug that. Not everybody does. That's cool. But and this idea of saying, why can't one just like it because of the stunts? Why not? Right. I think about it, again, taking my multiple interests here. I have an interest in the sort of Hollywood history and the history of exploitation films, right? And so exploitation as a term is really, as an industry term, focuses on what is the sensational content, right? It could be explosions, it could be violence, it could be martial arts, it could be nudity, it could be any number of things, but it is something sensational to get people's attention. right? And so I could say, you know what, I like action films for the explosions. There we go, or I like these films because of the nudity or because of the gore if it's horror or whatever. And there are going to be people who are going to sort of turn their nose up at that. So maybe I got to feel like I say, well, sure, yeah, there's the gore, but I really like the way they establish the special effects, right? Or yes, wrestling is exciting because of the fighting, but I really like the way that they intricately create this plot. Okay, that's fine. Maybe you do, right? But maybe some of it also may be this justification to oneself or to others. And for me, I'm kind of like, well, you know what? Whatever you like, you like. You like the explosions? God bless. Enjoy it, right? You do you. And just admit that. But I guess that's also an identity tension.
Yeah, definitely in wrestling, there's been some, uh, especially in WWE lately, there's been some experimental elements of like, and I guess like the Undertaker did this too, but like there's been some characters that have existed recently that have used like magic,
Mm-hmm.
um, or horror movie elements, and some people have just been, oh my God, I love it. It's like watching a horror movie. It's so
Mm-hmm.
great. And I've always been kind of personally, I'm confused. I'm like, well, if I wanted to watch a horror movie, I would watch a horror movie.
Mm-hmm.
I'm watching a pro wrestling show. So I want to see the match conclude by like, this guy pinning this guy and winning the title, not the match conclude by this guy feeding his opponent to a magical alligator in a mystical swamp, which legitimately happened at the end of a show a couple years ago. I'm not exaggerating that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but some people really dug the whole magic, mystical part of it. And I always found that kind of fascinating because it's like, why would I have so much better ways to get this kind of sense of entertainment than this very specific thing. There's nothing else quite like pro wrestling. But if I wanted to see magic and fantasy, there's a million other outlets for that. And that's something that I personally have had a hard time kind
Mm-hmm.
of rectifying with my own fandom. But obviously it has certainly appealed to other people.
Yeah. So I think just once again, me just kind of riffing here. Um, I really kind of like this idea of thinking of one's fan experience, and I use that broadly because, just technically speaking, fandom versus fanship in the literature is conceptually distinct. Fandom is the social aspect, and fanship is the connection to the product. So I'll in the interest of being sort of academically accurate, just say the fan experience, right? But thinking about it as this sort of audio mixer with a variety of different channels, right? And so it's going to look different for different folks. Maybe for you, there's a different permutation of those channels than the person who loved the magic element that gave them something that they needed that maybe you didn't, right? And that's fine. You know, this I've come to appreciate as I've delved back into this literature, right? It isn't the same thing as a movie, right? Because a movie is very curated. You can take as many takes as you want, right? And you could do that with, the spots between matches, right? Where people are um pursuing the characterization part of the story, right? But the stunts in a film are going to be different than the stunts in a match because those stunts are live, right? That's like live theater. Something goes south, you got to improv, right? If the audience starts to really dig something that a performer is doing, those wrestlers got to talk and say, okay, maybe we should do more of this to get that audience heat, right? Am I using that term correctly?
Yes, no, you're on board.
Okay, yeah. So I've really come to appreciate, as a non-fan, if you will, or just a watching it, like how intricate that delivery has to be, right? Compared to a movie where it is like, okay, shit, I got this wrong. We'll just do another take.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm gonna wrap things up there. Eric, are there anything you want to plug to my listeners that people they can follow you anywhere or anything like that?
So you can find me in different aspects. You can find me at the Illinois State University's psychology department webpage. That's my more traditional professional face. I'm on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now, at Eric Wesselmann. I have a film blog where the film nerd in me comes out, and as if you Google normal theater film culture, you'll find me there. And then I have a YouTube page called Digital Golgotha Productions. And that's where I have a lot of vodcasts where I discuss nerdy fandom related things with people. Sometimes if I video con panels will show up there too.
All right, excellent. Well, I want to thank Eric so much for joining the show. I want to thank to all of my listeners. I want to thank everyone who's had such kind words to say about some of our last few episodes. I think we're producing some excellent content here on the show, and this episode is no exception. So want to thank everyone for that. And I'll talk to you again after a while. Thanks.
Hello there, everybody. It's me, Garrett Kidney, the co-host of You've Got to Be Kidding Me on the Voices of Wrestling Podcasting Network.
And I am Liam Jones, my full name, and I'm also a part of the Voices of Wrestling Podcasting Network as a co-host for You've Got to Be Kidding Me.
We are a TNA history podcast that covers TNA 1 month at a time. We cover all the drama, all the matches, all the Vince Russo nonsense you could ever want in your life.
Have you heard of TNA? I bet you have, but would it be funnier if two people made jokes over it the whole time? Probably.
So if that sounds like fun to you, check it out on this very Voices of Wrestling Podcasting Network, and Liam will do bits and whatnot.